On May 9th, 2015, 46-year-old Marty Durham was sitting on his bed in Sand Lake, Michigan, and he couldn't stop laughing. Because his pet African gray parrot, named Bud, was perched in his cage near the bed, and the bird was just swearing and cussing up a storm. And Marty thought it was hysterical. African gray parrots are considered to be some of the very best mimics. They can imitate specific voices, and they can also have vocabularies of close to 1,000 words. And Bud's vocabulary clearly included more than a few swear words. As his parrot continued to cuss away, Marty began to hear voices coming from the living room. So he told Bud he'd see him later. Then Marty placed his hands firmly on the bed, and he slowly pushed himself up to his feet. Immediately, Marty felt a twinge of pain shoot through his legs, but he shook it off. About 20 years earlier, Marty had been in this terrible car accident, and he'd suffered very serious injuries. Marty had eventually recovered, but he'd had to battle pain in his legs and back ever since. And that pain had actually only gotten worse over time as Marty got older, and so now Marty had to actually wear a brace on one of his legs just to help him walk. Marty made his way from the bedroom down a hallway towards the living room. Marty was tall with short brown hair and a mustache, and he was wearing a t-shirt and denim shorts. Marty stepped into the living room, and he saw his wife Glenna was speaking with his adult son, who had stopped by to visit. Marty had 3 children from a previous marriage, and all of them were grown up and out of the house. But they still came by fairly often to spend time with their dad and their stepmom. Marty gave his son a hug, and then he sat down on the couch next to Glenna. The living room was almost like a shrine to Marty's favorite pastime, which was hunting. There were buckheads mounted on the wall as trophies, and the brown leather couch was draped with all these blankets that had images of deer on them. Marty's son asked how Bud the parrot was doing, and Marty just started laughing again, and then he told his son about how Bud was just ranting in the bedroom. Marty and his ex-wife, Christina, had had Bud since the kids were young, so Marty's son had grown up with this bird. After chatting for a bit, Marty asked his son and his wife if they wanted to go outside, and they said yes. So Glenna stood up and she helped Marty get to his feet. Glenna, like Marty, was 46 years old, and she had long brown hair and she wore glasses. Glenna unlocked the back door, and then the 3 of them stepped out onto the new wooden deck that Marty and Glenna had just put in. It was an absolutely perfect day, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty breathed in the fresh air, and he felt an utter sense of calm come over him. Being outside was like freedom to Marty. There was just nothing like it as far as he was concerned. And that was actually a huge reason why he'd bought the house where he and Glenna now lived. Years after Marty's terrible car accident, he had received some insurance money from the crash, and he had used that money to help him buy his blue wooden house in a very secluded area in the small rural town of Sand Lake. Marty loved the house itself, but it was actually the land that the house sat on that made him happier than almost anything else. From the deck, Marty looked out across the huge backyard at all the surrounding woods, and he couldn't help but think about his next hunting trip. If it were up to him, he'd go hunting or fishing every single day. But he knew he had to take it easy sometimes to give his legs a rest. Marty, Glenna, and Marty's son spent a good part of the day just sitting outside on the deck and talking. And then at some point, Marty's son said he needed to get home, so Marty stood up and he gave his son another hug, and then told him he'd see him soon. Then Marty's son said bye and left the deck and walked around the house towards the front where his car was, and Marty and Glenna just stayed out back on the deck. And hours later, Marty and Glenna were still outside, and they watched the sky turn gold and red as the sun began to set. Marty knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, and he had been through enough to know that everything could change in an instant. But there were times, like right now, when he just couldn't imagine being in a better place than he was. He had 3 kids that he loved dearly, and he was a grandfather with another grandchild on the way. He had this amazing house on this great land, and he was married to someone who he genuinely loved, Glenna. Marty and Glenna had actually first met when they were teenagers, and they had been attracted to each other right away. They began dating, and for a while, they spent as much time together as they could. Both Marty and Glenna had a shared love of nature, so they were always out and about walking around in the forest and going on long walks together, and they also spent a lot of time together hanging out with friends in town. But then, to the shock of a lot of their friends, Marty and Glenna had broken up and gone their separate ways. And not long after they had broken up, they both got married to other people. Marty married Christina, his first wife, and they had 3 kids together and their pet parrot Bud, and for years they had a pretty happy life together. And Glenna had gotten married and had kids of her own too. After Marty's car accident, Christina, his first wife, helped him a lot during his recovery. But their relationship started to become strained over time, and they ended up getting divorced about 5 years after Marty's wreck. Then Marty had moved out, bought the blue wooden house on the amazing land, and continued to raise his kids. It turned out that Glenna had also gotten a divorce, and Marty and Glenna, who had almost been inseparable as teenagers, ultimately reconnected and rekindled their relationship. Glenna had moved back in with Marty back in 2001, and a few years later, they had gotten married. Some of their friends thought it seemed like no time had passed at all, like somehow Marty and Glenna were the exact same together as they had been when they were kids. They could still just sit down and talk for hours at a time and not get bored, and they still love spending loads of time outdoors together. On the backyard deck, Marty and Glenna watched the last rays of sun disappear and then went inside the house. Glenna went to the kitchen to get dinner ready, and Marty headed to the bedroom. On the way to the bedroom, he checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Marty had always been someone who was very cautious, and so he liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted even when he and Glenna were home during the day. Some of that precaution was really just because that was Marty's nature, but it was also because Marty knew he kept several hunting weapons and handguns in the house, so if someone did come into the home, he knew things could turn violent very quickly. And even though they did live in a pretty secluded area, there was a road not too far from them, so people did pass by them, and Marty just didn't want to take any chances. Marty walked into his bedroom, and he saw Bud the parrot bobbing back and forth on his perch. Then Marty stepped into the bathroom, and he took a prescription pain pill out of a bottle on the counter, and he washed the pill down with water from the sink. Marty took a deep breath, went back into the bedroom, and sat down on the bed. Marty didn't usually take as many pain pills as were prescribed to him for a day, but sometimes in the evening, his leg pain got a lot worse, and the pills really helped. But even with the big inconvenience of chronic pain, and some of the other issues his car accident had caused over the years, Marty still tried hard not to dwell on the past. And as he sat there waiting for his pain meds to kick in, he smiled because he was thankful for what he had. A great family, a house he loved, and a foul-mouthed talking bird who could always make him laugh. On the evening of May 11th, 2015, so 2 days after Marty's son had come to visit, the smell of Italian food wafted through Marty and Glenna's house. Marty walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, then Glenna came over and put down a plate of spaghetti and garlic bread in front of him, and then she also put another plate down for herself, and she sat down across from Marty. As they ate dinner, Marty talked about wanting to plan a trip with some friends to go hunting wild boar and ram. Those types of hunting trips were far more complicated to coordinate than deer hunting trips in this area. And the pain in Marty's legs often made it very difficult for him to drive, which might make the trip even more complicated. Still, Marty was excited to try to put the trip together, and Glenna didn't have any objections. She often drove Marty to his doctor's appointments or other important places he had to go, and so they could figure something out for the hunting trip if they needed to. After dinner, Glenna picked up the plates and left them on the counter in the kitchen. Then Marty and Glenna went to the living room and watched TV for a couple of hours. Finally, just after midnight, Marty was tired, so he said goodnight to Glenna, he got up, and he went to their bedroom. Glenna told him she was going to stay up a bit longer and look at her phone. Once he was in the bedroom, Marty undressed and got into bed. He then said goodnight to Bud the parrot, then flipped off the light and went to sleep. But hours later, at about 5 a.m., Marty suddenly woke up feeling really startled. He heard his closet door open, and then he heard shouting. And then Bud the parrot began squawking from his perch, and Marty was just so confused he had no idea what was going on. But then Marty's eyes focused in the low light, and he saw there was someone standing in his bedroom just a few feet away. And so Marty shouted at this person in the room, and the bird squawked even louder. Over 24 hours later, so on May 13th, Marty and Glenna's neighbor watched smoke rising into the air not far from her house. Then the neighbor heard the screams of sirens and saw a fire truck barreling down her road. The neighbor was very worried about Marty and Glenna. She had texted both of them several times the day before, but neither of them had responded, and this just was not like them. The neighbor and Marty and Glenna were all very good friends, and they talked and texted all the time, and they were always very quick to get back to each other. The neighbor had also gone by Marty and Glenna's house the day before, but the couple hadn't been home. And so now that this neighbor is seeing fire trucks come bombing down her road and she's seeing smoke in the air, naturally she worried that the fire might be coming from Marty and Glenna's house. And so the neighbor just ran outside and began running down the street towards Marty and Glenna's house. And as she ran down the road, she saw the fire trucks up ahead coming to a stop and the firefighters jumping down off the truck to get the hoses ready to put out the fire. But as the neighbor went down the road, she realized that it was actually a small fire that was not on Marty and Glenna's property. Their house was not on fire. And so the neighbor was totally relieved. But since the neighbor was already outside, they decided they would just go to Marty and Glenna's house to see if maybe they were home now. But when the neighbor crossed Marty and Glenna's huge front yard and arrived on their front porch and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The neighbor thought about leaving, but she just couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong with Marty and Glenna. So the neighbor just reached down and grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, and shockingly, the doorknob turned because the door was unlocked. And this really frightened the neighbor. She knew how much Marty liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted basically all the time. The neighbor cautiously opened up the door and then stepped inside the house, and then began calling out to Marty and Glenna. But the house was silent. So the neighbor turned the corner and walked into the living room, and when she did, it was like her heart skipped a beat, because the place was a total wreck. A lamp had been tipped over and knocked off a table, and there were papers and trash scattered all across the floor. Then the neighbor heard the parrot, Bud, begin to squawk in Marty and Glenna's bedroom. So the neighbor walked down the hallway to the bedroom, and they stepped inside, and Bud, who was in the back cage, squawked louder and louder, and the neighbor just kind of looked around the bedroom, and at first it just looked like a normal bedroom, except for the fact that all the blankets from the bed were basically piled on the ground right in front of the door. So the neighbor stepped over those blankets and began walking towards the back of the bedroom to see what was next to the bed, and when she saw what was on the ground next to the bed, the neighbor just froze. Because there, next to the bed on the ground, was Marty, in his underwear, with his face and chest covered in blood. The neighbor was totally shocked, and they turned to run out of the room, but as soon as she turned, she looked down and realized now from her vantage point, she could see that actually Glenna was inside of those blankets that she had stepped over when she first came in. And now the neighbor was seeing Glenna's face, and Glenna's skin was pale and her hair was matted down with blood. And the neighbor just screamed and jumped over Glenna and ran out of that house and then screamed for all the firefighters who were right nearby putting out that small fire. And one of the firefighters saw the neighbor and rushed over to her, and after she explained what she just found in her friend's house, the firefighter motioned for two of the first responders, and then the three of them ran into Marty and Glenna's house. And then as soon as they walked into the bedroom and actually saw Marty and Glenna on the ground, the first responders knew they were dealing with a crime scene. And so one of the firefighters called police dispatch, and he said they had just found 2 dead bodies, and they needed police on the scene ASAP. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Gary Wilson of the Michigan State Police arrived in front of Marty and Glenna's house. Sergeant Wilson saw an ambulance and a fire truck nearby, and there were multiple firefighters, paramedics, and state troopers standing outside the house. Sergeant Wilson got out of his car and walked over to one of the firefighters. The firefighter explained that they had to put out a small fire in the area, but then this woman had come running out of Marty and Glenna's house screaming for help. The firefighter said, once they had seen what was inside of the house, members of the fire department and other first responders were instructed to stay outside until police arrived, because it was believed the house was now a crime scene. Now, Sergeant Wilson had been told all of this already by police dispatch. He also had been told that he was very likely responding to a double suicide. But when Wilson approached the house, one of the state troopers went over to meet him, and that trooper believed there was a strong chance they were actually dealing with a double homicide, not double suicide. Wilson followed the trooper inside the house to the bedroom, and when Wilson saw Marty on the floor, he was also pretty sure the man had not killed himself. Marty had multiple gunshot wounds, and there was no weapon nearby. Then Wilson stepped over to the pile of blankets on the floor to get a better look at Glenna's body, but when he crouched down on one knee and leaned in closer to her, he heard a loud gasp. Glenna's eyes opened, and then she screamed. Wilson stood and stumbled back a few steps. He was in shock. But he quickly called for a paramedic and kept shouting over and over again that she's alive, guys, get in here. Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and began working to get Glenna oxygen. Then they put her on a stretcher, wheeled her outside, and got her into the ambulance. As the ambulance sped away to the hospital, Wilson stood in Glenna and Marty's bedroom, trying to recover from the shock of what had just happened. And then once he'd caught his breath and calmed down, Sergeant Wilson called in that one of the victims, who everybody thought was dead, was actually alive. And also, Wilson said he believed they were not dealing with a suicide, but a murder, and so he needed a forensics team. Not long after Glenna woke up in the bedroom, a state forensics team arrived at the property and began doing a thorough sweep. In the bedroom, not far from Marty's body, they found several bullet casings. They also found a key to Marty's gun safe on the floor, and they located the safe in the closet. So Wilson's first thought was that someone who knew that Marty kept guns in his safe had taken the key, gotten a weapon out of the safe, and then using that weapon, they had killed Marty and attempted to kill Glenna. And the idea that the killer was someone the couple knew made sense because there was no sign of forced entry in the house. Now, Marty and Glenna's neighbor had found the front door unlocked, so it was possible that maybe Marty or Glenna had unknowingly welcomed the killer into their home. But the forensics team also found something very strange in the bedroom. Marty had died while clutching a patch of hair in his right hand, so they would need to run DNA tests to see if the hair matched Marty's or if it belonged to someone else, like maybe his killer. Sergeant Wilson heard someone calling to him from the living room, so he stepped out of the bedroom and headed that way. When he got there, he saw a forensics officer on the ground bagging a piece of evidence. The officer had found a .22 caliber Ruger revolver underneath one of the living room chairs. Sergeant Wilson knew they would have to wait for ballistics testing to see if this revolver really was the murder weapon, but Wilson already had a strong feeling that very likely this was the murder weapon. And he was almost positive that that gun must have come out of Marty's safe. After several hours in the house, Wilson felt like he still had a lot of questions to answer, so he called the hospital in hopes that Glenna was now in stable condition and able to talk to him about who had shot her and her husband. But doctors would tell him that Glenna, unfortunately, was still very much recovering from her wound and not really in a good position to talk to him, at least not yet. So Sergeant Wilson decided if he couldn't talk to Marty's wife, then he would just start his investigation with other members of Marty's family, his kids. On May 14th, so a day after Marty's body had been discovered, Marty's two sons and his daughter climbed under the crime scene tape outside of Marty's house and approached the front door. They all stood at the door, still in total shock. How could this place that had made them so happy over the years now be just a violent crime scene? It just didn't make sense to them. The siblings entered the house. They were there to pick up Bud the parrot so they could bring him back to their mother, Marty's ex-wife Christina. But before they actually made it to the bedroom to grab Bud, they were all stunned by the mess in the living room. Their dad and their stepmother had always kept the house very neat and tidy, so it didn't even look like the same place. Then something caught their attention. A large manila envelope was on the living room floor amongst the mess, and so one of Marty's sons crouched down and opened the envelope and looked inside. And he showed the contents to his brother and sister, and they all agreed this was something they should hold on to. Then they went to the bedroom to get Bud the parrot. Soon after they had left, the siblings brought Bud to their mother's house. Then they decided to show the police the manila envelope they had found. Later that day, after Marty's children had contacted the police, they were brought into the local station to be interviewed. Sergeant Wilson had already planned to begin his investigation with Marty's kids, but now that they have this manila envelope, he was so eager to speak with them. Wilson knew there was a good chance that he was simply dealing with three grief-stricken young people who had just lost their father, but he still could not eliminate any of Marty's kids as potential suspects, at least not yet. So Wilson first led Marty's oldest son, Justin, into a small office at the station. Wilson wanted to meet with each of Marty's kids separately. He believed that if one of the kids had information about the case, they were more likely to share it if each of them was on their own. In the office, Wilson told Justin they were not accusing him of anything. They just wanted to talk to him to see if he had any information that could help with their investigation. And Justin was very calm and seemed eager to cooperate. Wilson asked Justin if he knew about any enemies his father might have, or if his dad had recently had a falling out with any of his friends. Justin said he couldn't think of anyone. He said his dad was really close with his neighbors and his hunting buddies, and they all seemed to get along really well. But then, Justin got a look on his face like he just remembered something. He looked up at Wilson and told him that there were a bunch of people who knew his father had a big supply of prescription pain medication inside of his house. When Wilson heard this, he immediately sat back in his chair and just thought for a second. At the time, the opioid epidemic in the United States was near its height. Prescription painkillers, like the ones Marty took, were in very high demand, and addicts had been known to commit terrible crimes to get a hold of these drugs. So Sergeant Wilson started to wonder if someone who knew Marty had killed him and attempted to kill his wife simply to get a hold of Marty's pills. After they talked a bit longer, Wilson thanked Justin for his cooperation and told him police would be in touch if they needed anything else. Later that day, Wilson and other investigators met with Marty's 2 other kids, and their version of events surrounding their visit to their dad and stepmother's house and the manila envelope they found in the living room were all basically the same. So, in the following days, investigators met with other people who were close to Marty to see if they had any information they might be able to add. And one of the people investigators spoke to said she knew that Marty's guns were not the only things that he and Glenna kept locked up in their safe. They also kept a couple of $1,000s in cash locked up. But, as Sergeant Wilson knew, no cash had been found inside of that safe. And so suddenly, the information about this missing money and the information Marty's son had given about Marty's pills started to paint a picture of what happened for investigators. And so now their theory was that someone Marty and Glenna knew had possibly come to their house with the intention of robbing them of their cash and their prescription drugs. So Wilson wanted to meet with anyone who had known about the safe in the couple's house to see if he could track down the missing money and Marty and Glenna's attacker. It had only been about a week since the attack, but Sergeant Wilson and the rest of his team were already getting frustrated. They felt like they had all these puzzle pieces right in front of them, but none of the pieces seemed to connect. There was the missing money from the safe, there was that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found in the living room, and there was the potential that somebody had wanted to steal Marty's prescription pain pills. But as investigators spoke to just about anybody who had any connection to Marty and Glenna, they couldn't find any evidence that sort of pointed to a particular person, a primary suspect, and they still had no leads on the missing money. Wilson had desperately hoped that Glenna would be able to provide the missing pieces that would make the puzzle kind of come together, but she was still recovering in the hospital, and so for now, an interview was still not possible. But when the investigation began to look like it was genuinely running into a dead end and might go cold, Michigan State Trooper Barry Wolf took a phone call at his desk. Wolf, like other members of the investigative team, had been worried about the lack of progress they were making. But as he listened to this caller on the other line, he wasn't sure if he was getting the tip police had been hoping for, or if he was about to be sent on an insane wild goose chase. The caller was a woman who was named Fran Fallon. She was the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a self-proclaimed psychic. On the phone, Fran told Officer Wolf that she had received important information about Marty's murder during a psychic reading, and she'd like to share this information with the police. And so Wolf told Fran he'd be right over to see her. Then, Officer Wolf told Sergeant Wilson about this call, and neither of the men really believed in psychic phenomena. But a person saying they had potentially important information about this case, especially someone who had a family connection to the victim, couldn't be ignored. So after speaking to Wilson, Wolf left the building, got into his cruiser, and went to meet Fran at her house to see what her supposed visions had shown her. When Wolf arrived, he found Fran sitting on her back porch, and she motioned for him to join her. Wolf introduced himself, thanked Fran for contacting him, and then took a seat next to her. Fran spoke in a low but very confident voice. She knew some people thought she was crazy or just making things up, but she trusted her psychic gifts, and she felt like the police should trust them too. Fran reached down beside her and took a small notebook out of a folder. She told Wolf that she had written down information she'd received during a recent psychic vision. Then she flipped open the notebook and began reading. Fran told Wolf that it was important for police to look under the couch or the love seat in Marty and Glenna's living room. Then Fran looked up and stared directly into Wolf's eyes and told him that Marty's right hand was also going to be very important to the investigation. When she said this, Wolf sat back in his chair and just stared at Fran in disbelief. Investigators had found that Ruger underneath a chair in the living room. Sure, that wasn't the same as a couch or a love seat, but that was pretty close. Also, Wolf was shocked to hear Fran mention Marty's right hand because Marty had been found clutching that patch of hair in his right hand. But Wolf's first thought was not that this woman was actually psychic. It was instead that she clearly had information about a crime scene that only somebody who had been there would know about. And so Wolf did not want to alarm Fran in any way that he could be onto her, and so instead he just smiled and told her that this was very interesting, and then he asked her where she had been at the time Marty was murdered. And Fran would tell him that she had been with her daughter. After that, Wolf thanked Fran again for getting in touch with him, and then he walked off her porch and went back to his car. Once he was inside and turned it back on, he gunned the engine and sped back to the station to tell the rest of the investigative team about this weird meeting. And once he did tell them about this weird meeting, the Michigan State Police had to either accept that Fran really got this information from a psychic reading she'd done, or they would have to add a local psychic to their list of suspects. Sergeant Wilson told investigators to follow up on Fran's alibi, and he could barely believe the turn this investigation was taking. But it wouldn't be long before Wilson realized having a psychic involved was not remotely the weirdest thing about this case. In October of 2015, so almost 5 months after the attack that left Marty dead, Sergeant Wilson finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Glenna had been released from the hospital, and she was now able to speak with police. Investigators had spent the last few months searching for that lost money and looking into the psychic's background, and they had come up empty. They had potential suspects, but none of them seemed all that viable. But now, Wilson would be able to talk to someone who was literally there when the attack happened, Glenna, and he hoped she'd be able to clear up a lot of the questions that he and his team still had. Glenna met with Wilson at the police station, and after they made it into the interview room, Wilson asked her, what do you remember about the day that you and your husband were attacked? And immediately, when Glenna began to talk, Wilson knew he was not going to get the clear-cut evidence he had been hoping for. Glenna told him she'd been struggling with her memory ever since she arrived at the hospital. She said she could barely remember anything about the day of the shooting, or even the days leading up to it. Wilson knew Glenna was dealing with a serious head injury, so her memory loss did not come as much of a surprise. But he still believed Glenna was going to be the key to figuring out who killed Marty. So Wilson began talking to Glenna about pieces of evidence that had been found at the scene, hoping maybe something would spark her memory. But by the end of the interview, Glenna had not remembered anything that could point the investigation in any one direction, and so Wilson began to feel lost again. So, as the weeks and months passed, investigators continued to pursue all of their potential leads, but they still had no clear killer, and Marty's family was now also starting to become very frustrated. They wanted answers, and they wanted some kind of closure. But even as the 1-year anniversary of Marty's murder approached, the case was still open, and people close to Marty had no idea if it would ever be closed. In May of 2016, so a year after Marty was killed, a news reporter for a Grand Rapids, Michigan TV station stared at a video playing on his computer screen. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open. This guy couldn't believe what he was watching. On the video, Marty's pet parrot, Bud, was clinging to the side of his cage, and he was shouting in Marty's voice. Then the parrot's voice would completely change, and he would speak in somebody else's voice who was not shouting, and then the parrot would shift back into Marty's voice, and he would keep on shouting. The reporter was watching Bud mimic an argument the bird clearly had heard between Marty and somebody else, and the reporter was almost certain the other voice that Bud was mimicking belonged to Marty's killer, and that this argument must have taken place right before the murder. Because at one point in the video, Bud mimicked Marty's voice by yelling, "Don't fucking shoot!" The reporter watched the entire video, and then when it was done, he watched it again. And afterwards, he knew it had to be aired. The news station contacted Marty's first wife, Christina, who had gotten Bud back after Marty was killed. Christina told producers at the station that she was the one who had shot that video about a month after Marty's murder, but she had only told people who were close to her about it. She had never intended for it to make the news. But around the year anniversary of Marty's death, Marty's parents had done a follow-up interview with a local TV station, and during that interview, the video of Bud the Parrot screaming "Don't fucking shoot" had come up, and eventually that video of Bud was shown to the local news crew. And then somehow, the video made its way to the much larger TV station in Grand Rapids. And not long after that, the Grand Rapids TV station played Bud's video on the news, and soon the story got picked up all over the world. Suddenly, Bud the Parrot seemed like a hero. He was like a key witness to an unsolved murder, and everyone believed he was going to be the key to solving the case. The worldwide attention Bud's video brought to Marty's murder might have put added pressure on the investigative team, but police insisted that the Parrot video did not change the way they were pursuing the case. Then, in June, a month after Bud's video appeared on TV, investigators announced they had actually made an arrest in Marty's murder case. Police maintained that Bud the Parrot's supposed eyewitness account of the murder had nothing to do with the arrest. It just so happened that at this time, they had finally figured out who took the money from Marty's safe, and soon after that, they had discovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led them to Marty's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of May 12, 2015, when someone killed Marty Durham in his bedroom. At 5 a.m. on May 12, 2015, the glow from the killer's phone lit their face as they walked down the hallway inside of Marty and Glenna's house. The killer was breathing heavily, and they were scared and nervous, but they managed to walk quietly towards the bedroom. Once they got there, the killer opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. The low light from the killer's phone provided enough illumination that the killer could see the African gray parrot in its cage. The killer quickly walked across the room to the closet, then they opened it up and used their phone light to locate the key to the large gun safe that was inside. Once they had the key, the killer held their breath and unlocked the safe. Tucked away amongst several hunting rifles, they found a loaded .22 caliber Ruger revolver. The killer grabbed the gun and stared at it in their hand for a second. Then they turned, stepped out of the closet, approached the bed, and just started yelling. And immediately, Marty, who was in bed, he sat up, totally startled, and the noise caused Bud the Parrot to start squawking, which only added to the confusion. Marty kind of shook himself awake, and he saw the killer just standing there, and still not sure what was happening, Marty just began screaming too, so Marty, the parrot, and the killer are all yelling. But then, in the light from the killer's phone, and the glow from the moon that was coming in through the window, Marty noticed the killer had a gun by their side. And so Marty pulled himself up and out of bed, and right away he very likely felt that pain shooting through his legs and back, and at the same time Bud keeps squawking from his cage, and the killer kept shouting at Marty. I mean, it was absolutely chaos, but Marty was still hopeful he could maybe get out of there. And so Marty raised up his hands in a defensive position and tried to walk past the killer. The killer raised the gun and aimed it right at Marty's chest, and Marty screamed, "Don't fucking shoot!" But the killer fired. It fired 3 shots in rapid succession, hitting Marty in the chest again and again and again. Then the killer fired 2 more times, and those bullets struck Marty's forearm and his back as he fell. Marty collapsed on the floor, dead. And the killer just stood there, staring down at Marty's body. Then the killer took a deep breath, calmly walked out of the bedroom, and made their way towards the front door, and they unlocked it. Then the killer made their way to the living room, and they tipped a lamp off an end table onto the floor. Then they emptied a desk drawer and some shelves and made a total mess of the place. Then the killer just kind of stood there, scanning around their house, looking at what they had just done. So far, their plan had gone exactly the way they hoped, but the hardest part was yet to come. Finally, the killer took several deep breaths, doing their best to stay calm and steady. Then they raised their gun and placed the barrel behind their right ear, and they pulled the trigger. Immediately, blood began pouring out of the wound, and the room began to spin, but the killer kept their balance long enough to toss the gun under a nearby living room chair. Then the killer stumbled back into the bedroom and fell down onto the ground, and before they passed out, they grabbed a huge pile of blankets nearby and pulled them up and over their head. It would turn out Glenna had murdered Marty, and then obviously shot herself in the head. It turned out that Marty and Glenna's marriage had not been as perfect as some of their friends believed. Over the years, Glenna had racked up a huge amount of debt. She had lost about $75,000 gambling at nearby casinos, and as a result, she had stopped making mortgage payments on their house. But Marty never knew any of that. Not long before the murder, Glenna had learned that the house that Marty loved so much was now going into foreclosure, and so soon he would learn the truth and they would both be forced out. Early on in the investigation, police had actually learned about the pending foreclosure, and they discovered Glenna's gambling habit. So they started to think that Glenna had killed Marty and then tried to kill herself, seeing a murder-suicide as her only way out. And this murder-suicide theory was only bolstered when police looked inside of that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found when they went to Marty's house to get Bud. The manila envelope contained several letters that Glenna had written to her kids and to her ex-husband. In the letters, Glenna expressed how sorry she was and asked them to please take care of each other. Police believed those letters sounded like suicide notes. But in a case involving a psychic and a talking bird, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Because if it was a murder-suicide, why had thousands of dollars been taken from the safe? Why was the house completely wrecked? And why had the gun been hidden in the living room when Marty and Glenna were found in their bedroom? Those were questions investigators had to answer if they were ever going to determine what had really happened. Finally, investigators discovered who had taken the money from the safe because Marty's kids had come forward and admitted they took the cash when they went to collect Bud the parrot. Even though Marty's kids had taken the money, police still didn't consider them primary suspects. Instead, they thought Marty's kids were just young and foolish and had made a very bad decision. So, with the money from the safe now accounted for, investigators were able to rule it out as a motive for the murder. And the psychic's alibi eventually checked out, so the investigators crossed her off of their suspect list, but they would be left wondering how she seemed to know undisclosed details about the crime scene. DNA tests conducted on the hair found inside of Marty's hand also did not end up helping investigators. So all of this brought Sergeant Wilson and his team back to the possibility of a murder and failed suicide attempt committed by Glenna. But of course, there were still unanswered questions. It wasn't like they had found the gun in Glenna's hand. Then, in early summer of 2016, the media and the public latched onto that viral video of Bud the parrot saying, "Don't fucking shoot," and many claimed the other voice that Bud was speaking in sounded an awful lot like Glenna. But police continued to rely on more common investigative techniques to determine if Glenna was, in fact, the killer. They dug deep into Glenna's phone records and internet history, and when they had a clear picture of Glenna's online activity, they got the break in the case they had been looking for. It turned out that hours before Marty's murder, Glenna had been online researching various aspects of the .22 caliber Ruger revolver, the type of gun used to kill Marty. And some investigators believed Glenna had learned a lot more than just how to fire or reload the weapon. They thought she had found a way to shoot herself that would allow her to live and enable her to keep functioning even after she had pulled the trigger. In fact, a neurosurgeon would testify in court that the wounds found behind Glenna's ear were non-lethal, and that those wounds would not necessarily result in a loss of consciousness. This meant that Glenna could have shot herself in the head in the living room and then still managed to hide the gun, get back to the bedroom, and get into position under the blankets, all before she was found. So, as bizarre as this case had seemed at times, investigators believed they had solved the most important part of the puzzle, that Glenna had murdered Marty. Some people close to the case would continue to believe that the crime was still the result of Glenna's failed murder-suicide plan, meaning Glenna really did intend to end her life, but just didn't, because where she shot herself was non-lethal, even though Glenna denied the letters she had written to her family were suicide notes. Others believed there were even darker motives at play, and that Glenna murdered Marty, then tried to make it look like a robbery, and then also tried to make herself look like a victim too, so they didn't believe suicide was ever part of Glenna's plan, that she definitely did try to intentionally shoot the part of her head that wouldn't kill her. This was all a big con. But it's not clear what Glenna's motives were for doing this. Like, what did she stand to gain by killing her husband and framing this whole thing? It just didn't make any sense. But regardless of what the actual reason was for why Glenna did what she did, by the summer of 2016, police had enough evidence to arrest her. Glenna was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2019, Bud the parrot was living with Marty's first wife, Christina, and a fellow African gray parrot named Ozzy. Christina said the two birds have become best friends. On the evening of March 27, 1937, a 20-year-old woman named Veronica Ronnie Gideon walked alone down a dark street in New York City. She hugged herself against the early spring chill as she made her way to the home of a man she barely knew. Ronnie's boyfriend had left for the Easter weekend to visit his family, so he had asked his best friend to keep an eye on Ronnie while he was away. That friend had invited Ronnie to his place for dinner and then an evening of drinking and dancing. And that's where Ronnie was headed right now. She was feeling a bit nervous, but also excited, and she was wearing one of her favorite outfits, a pretty blue tea dress. Ronnie thought it was pretty funny that her boyfriend was so worried she might cheat on him that he had basically set her up on a date tonight himself. Sure, a second man was going to join Ronnie and her boyfriend's best friend, but that just meant Ronnie would be out on the town with two men that were not her boyfriend. And they planned to stay out at the bars until they closed at 3 a.m. But even if she didn't admit this, Ronnie did understand why she made her boyfriend nervous. She was totally gorgeous, with a bubbly personality and a quick sense of humor. She also had a modeling career that was really starting to get her noticed, too. In fact, recently, she'd started to think she could actually become a famous model. Only a few days earlier, the latest issue of Inside Detective magazine had hit newsstands all over the city, and there on the cover was Ronnie herself. In the photo, she looked terrified, with one arm shielding her face and the other covering her bare chest. The picture was supposed to illustrate an alarming story called Party Girl, about unmarried young women who like to drink and have premarital sex until they all get sent to jail for immorality. In the 1930s, true crime magazines that featured barely dressed young women in danger were enormously popular. And Ronnie had appeared on several covers with headlines like "Pretty but cheap" and "I am a white slave." But the real Ronnie was nothing like those pictures. She liked to go out and have a good time, but she wasn't wild. She had only been in love one time, when she was 16 years old and she eloped with a family friend named Bobby Flower, but that marriage ended disastrously after only a few weeks. And for many nights after that breakup, Ronnie felt heartbroken about losing Bobby, and she'd write about him in her diary until she fell asleep. And now, 4 years later, despite having a new boyfriend, Ronnie wasn't actually looking for love. She was just looking to have fun. And what better place than New York City, Ronnie thought as she stepped off the curb to cross Fifth Avenue. And at that moment, a yellow taxicab zipped by close enough to make Ronnie jump back and jolt her out of her daydream. And then, after collecting herself, she looked up and she could see she was just a few blocks away from Steve's place near Central Park. Steve's neighborhood was way more fashionable than Ronnie's. Ronnie still lived at home with her mother, Mary Gideon, in a tiny fourth-floor apartment near the East River. Ronnie found her home to be pretty depressing. Her mother had been unhappily married to her father, Joseph Gideon, for decades, until her father had left the family 3 years earlier. Joseph was a sour man who repaired furniture for a living, and he did not approve of Ronnie's love of the nightlife. Ronnie had been relieved when he moved out, though he still had a key and came over on holidays and on some weekends. But even without Ronnie's dad around, the apartment was still overcrowded. This was the Great Depression, and people often rented extra rooms to strangers to raise extra money. One of Mary and Ronnie's roommates was a boarder named Frank Burns, who lived in one of the bedrooms and joined the family at dinner each night. and the other boarder was one of Ronnie's friends, who was just staying temporarily. So lately, Ronnie had been sharing the same bed as her mother. Ronnie loved her mother, but she sometimes felt like the walls were closing in when they would spend the evening together listening to the radio in their tiny living room. It was even harder when Frank joined them. He was partially deaf, and her mother had to turn the radio up super loud just so he could hear his favorite show, Amos and Andy. And Frank was just one in a parade of boarders who intruded on Ronnie's family life. Ronnie recalled one other boarder, a struggling artist named Bob Irwin, who wanted to marry her big sister, Ethel. Her sister was a very beautiful woman, but who hid her beauty behind horn-rimmed glasses and hair that was pulled into a tight bun. She said she was not interested in Bob, but Bob never gave up. He continued to drop in on the family even after he had moved out. In short, the apartment had long felt like a prison to Ronnie. By comparison, she felt absolutely free when she went out to the bars and clubs of New York. Just then, Ronnie passed by the famous Radio City Music Hall where she had seen the movie Snow White with her boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, a couple of months earlier. And they had had so much fun, Ronnie remembered, and the colors were totally amazing. Lincoln liked to tell people that the two of them were engaged, which was not actually true, but they were a pretty good couple. And thinking about this made Ronnie feel kind of strange that she was now about to go have dinner and drinks with Lincoln's best friend. Ronnie approached the front door of her boyfriend's friend, Stephen Butter, a little before 8 p.m. As she climbed the front steps, she could hear big band swing music blaring from Stephen's radio. She rang the bell. Moments later, Stephen, who was dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit complete with a pocket handkerchief, opened the door and welcomed Ronnie inside with a theatrical bow. This was going to be a fun night. For the next 6 hours, Ronnie lost herself in the evening with Stephen and his other friend. They had planned to go bar hopping, but they were having such a good time dancing to the radio music while drinking gin and beer that they just stayed at Stephen's place until quite late. Stephen expected Ronnie to make them dinner, but she wasn't offended. The kitchen was considered women's work in those days, so Ronnie made a pasta dinner for all three of them. Stephen was not quite as handsome as Ronnie's boyfriend, and his family was not quite as wealthy. But Ronnie thought he was still very charming and had lots of promise. He was working on Wall Street after all, and the more gin and beer they drank, the more they flirted and danced cheek to cheek. Finally, at 2 a.m., Stephen's other friend called it a night and went home, but Steve and Ronnie decided their night was not quite done. They threw on their coats and they headed for the Monte Carlo Bar and Grill, which was on the way to Ronnie's apartment, for a few more gin highballs. As Ronnie swallowed her last sip of alcohol, she thought about how her night might have turned out if she'd listened to her mother. Mary had wanted Ronnie home to help in the kitchen. Tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and they were expecting guests, Ronnie's sister Ethel and her husband, as well as their father. But Ronnie had secretly slipped out the door for the evening while her mother was still out shopping for the pork loin and green beans. Ronnie felt guilty, but not too much. By the time Steve escorted Ronnie back to her apartment building, they were leaning on each other to keep from falling down. But they both knew that since Ronnie was dating Steve's best friend, they shouldn't let things get romantic. So instead of a goodnight kiss, Steve offered to escort Ronnie to church the next morning for Easter Mass at 10, and she happily said yes. Ronnie let herself in the main building door and began climbing the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. She was a little dizzy from all the booze, but she felt lighthearted. Steve had been a good companion for the evening, and she was glad that she'd see him again in the morning. Ronnie walked in the door of her apartment at about 3 a.m., trying to be extra quiet so she didn't wake up the people inside, which included her mother and one of the 2 boarders named Frank. As for the other boarder, which was Ronnie's friend, they were out of town. Ronnie quietly ducked into the bathroom near the front door and undressed down to her slip. She took off her makeup and washed her face and hands. She brushed her teeth and then brushed her hair. And then finally, she was ready for bed, and so she tiptoed to the dark, silent bedroom where she and her mother slept. As she entered the bedroom, Ronnie couldn't see or hear a thing, not even her mother's breathing. And then suddenly, a hard object struck Ronnie in the face. It stunned Ronnie far more than it hurt her, but she was so terrified and confused she didn't move an inch. And then a second later, a man's hand came out of the blackness and squeezed around Ronnie's throat and then shoved her roughly onto the bed. "Please don't touch me," Ronnie managed to croak in little more than a whisper, but the man just squeezed tighter. The next morning was Easter, and Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, woke up feeling totally hungover inside of the little room he had been renting since he separated from Ronnie's mother, Mary. But despite Joseph's throbbing headache from all the beers and shots of alcohol he had drank the night before, Joseph was actually in a great mood. He was going to have dinner with his family, and he and his estranged wife, Mary, had big news. After 3 years of separation, they were actually going to give married life another try. Joseph could not wait to tell his 2 daughters. Joseph slapped on his fedora hat and whistled as he walked the few blocks from his rented room to his wife's apartment, arriving a full half an hour before his 2:30 p.m. invitation. Not wanting to be rude by showing up early, Joseph found a payphone and called Mary, but no one answered. But Joseph didn't mind. He figured they must still be out at the Easter parade, and so in the meantime, he went shopping for gifts for his family, which included buying cigars that he planned to smoke with his daughter Ethel's husband to celebrate his reunion with his ex-wife Mary. But when Joseph returned back to Mary's apartment building and rang the front entrance door to the lobby at about 2:40 p.m., there was still no answer inside, and Joseph suddenly wondered if he had gotten the time wrong. Joseph was still standing right outside the main door of this building when his daughter Ethel and her husband came up behind him. Ethel told Joseph that he was right, the dinner was scheduled for 2:30 p.m., but she thought, maybe Mom might have the radio up too loud, and so she can't hear the buzzing of the bell when you ring it. And so Joseph nodded and tried the bell a couple more times, but still nobody opened up the front door. Eventually, another tenant inside the building heard all this buzzing and just let all 3 of them in the main door to the building. Joseph immediately bounded up the 4 flights of stairs to Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was going to give them a piece of his mind for leaving the Easter guests waiting outside. But when he got to the actual apartment door, leaving Ethel and her husband far behind, Joseph immediately knew something just wasn't right. The front door was not fully shut, it had not latched, and so when Joseph pushed on it just lightly, it flung open. And when he stepped into the living room, he saw Ronnie's little Pekingese dog named Tucci. Usually, Tucci would run right up to him, but today, Tucci stayed put and just sat there very reserved, with her ears flat against her head. Joseph called out for Mary and Ronnie, but there was only silence in the apartment. Joseph looked across to the kitchen and saw the pork, which was supposed to be today's dinner, sitting on the counter, obviously uncooked. Joseph went into the bedroom that Mary and Ronnie shared, but no one was there. Nothing was disturbed, except there were broken pieces of a bar of soap scattered all across the carpet. With mounting anxiety, Joseph then entered the second bedroom where Ronnie used to sleep until her friend moved in, and what he saw in there was worse than anything Joseph could have imagined. His daughter, Ronnie, was lying stark naked on the bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Her skin was the color gray-blue, and her neck was mottled with dark bruises. Joseph practically fell over in his haste to get out of the room containing his daughter's corpse. But when he stumbled into the third bedroom, there was only more horror. Frank, the boarder, was lying under the covers, the blanket right up to his neck, but his head was mutilated and covered in blood. Joseph could not take it anymore, and he just ran out of the apartment and began charging down the stairs while screaming, "They're all dead!" He breathlessly told Ethel and her husband about the terrible things he had just seen, and they both instantly went pale. But then Ethel asked, "Well, what about Mother?" Joseph said he had not seen her, and he just hoped she had escaped and ran to the police. And then Joseph did exactly that. He ran out of the apartment and then ran a block away to the neighborhood police station, where he reported what he had just found. Minutes later, Joseph returned to the apartment, now with a detective by his side. And almost immediately, the detective made another shocking discovery. He saw a foot sticking out from under the bed that Ronnie was lying on top of. Peering underneath, the detective could see there was another body, It was Mary Gideon, and she was fully dressed and had terrible bruising around her neck. Whoever had killed her had apparently tried to hide her body by wedging it beneath the bed. All three victims' bodies were very stiff by the time they were found. They had clearly all been dead for hours. By late Sunday afternoon, a small army of New York detectives, led by tough guy Assistant Chief Inspector John A. Lyons, had descended on Ronnie and Mary's apartment, and the flashbulbs of crime scene photographers popped in every room as they recorded details of the gruesome murders. The detectives found a single gray suede glove in Frank's bedroom, likely left behind by the killer. They also found Ronnie's torn silk panties behind the headboard where her body lay, suggesting it was her assailant who had removed her clothes, either before or after killing her. Aside from the corpses, though, the apartment seemed totally undisturbed. This was not a robbery. The killer came specifically for these people. Inspector Lyons concluded that the boarder, Frank, one of the victims, was probably killed first as he slept. Someone had stabbed him 11 times in the head, likely with an ice pick. His skull was nearly caved in. Both Ronnie and Mary had been strangled to death by someone's hands, and Mary, at least, had put up a fierce fight. She had bruises all over her knuckles. The detectives could not say for sure if the women had been sexually assaulted, but it seemed fairly obvious to Inspector Lyons that they must have. However, he would leave it to the medical examiner to confirm that detail. One other thing stood out to Inspector Lyons as he puffed on a cigar and watched another detective give Ronnie's dog a belly scratch. Why didn't the neighbors hear anything whilst 3 brutal murders were committed in the middle of the night? Tucci was the type of nervous little dog that barked incessantly at strangers. But apparently, Tucci had not made a sound at all, or had just been so quiet that neighbors were not woken up by the dog. But to Lyons, the implication here was clear. Whoever committed what would soon be known as the Easter Sunday Massacre must have known this dog well, so much so that the dog did not bark when they saw this person. The next day, the murders made the papers. In New York, there were newspapers that warned of a, quote, sex fiend that was on the loose in the city and that he would surely strike again. The media really fixated on the fact that Ronnie was this beautiful model who was found in the nude, and so they eagerly printed these photographs from Ronnie's modeling work where she was in various states of undress. By coincidence, Ronnie had been murdered exactly 1 year after another sensational murder just down the street. A delivery man had snuck into the apartment of writer Nancy Titterton and then assaulted her, strangled her, and left her tied up naked in her bathtub. Now, the Titterton murder seemed to be happening all over again, the newspaper said. One newspaper said that all American women were now in danger from the rising wave of sex murders. Locksmiths reported a sudden increase in lock sales to men eager to protect their women from predators. Inspector Lyons felt his blood pressure starting to rise as he read the morning headlines while he finished his breakfast. A story about the murder described Ronnie as being this prize beauty who was slaughtered by a sex-crazed lunatic who was still on the loose. To Lyons, stories like these just made his job harder, whipping up public fears and putting pressure on the police to find the killer faster, which he felt just encouraged sloppy detective work. Just then, as if on cue, the police commissioner himself called Lyons. And he told him to take as many detectives as he needed because solving the Easter Sunday Massacre was now the department's top goal. By the time Lyons set off for police headquarters that morning, he had a plan to employ 75 detectives who would talk to everyone who lived near the Gideons, and they would talk to anyone who knew the Gideons over the past few years. This would be one of the biggest criminal investigations in New York City's history. And Lyons would make it clear to his massive team of investigators that they should not hesitate to get rough with people if they had to. One of the first people brought in for questioning was Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. At 4 p.m. that Monday, Joseph Gideon reported to the same neighborhood police station where he came running to plead for help the day before. This time, though, he was trailed by a gang of reporters who were shouting questions at him while he remained grimly silent. Joseph expected to be treated as a grieving loved one, but the police treated him like a suspect from the start. They fingerprinted him and made him empty all his pockets to be sure he had no weapons. Then they relentlessly grilled him with questions for 12 hours as detectives took turns trying to get Joseph to break down. But over the course of this interview, Joseph only grew more ornery. Joseph had an alibi. Well, sort of. He had spent Saturday evening drinking at a bar and playing skee-ball with some other people who could confirm he was there. But by the time his daughter and his ex-wife were killed sometime after 3 a.m., Joseph was sleeping off the bender in his bed with no witnesses. One detective called Joseph a liar for saying he had nothing to do with the heinous crime, so Joseph called the detective a liar right back. Police eventually had to let Joseph go at about 4 a.m. on Tuesday because they had absolutely no evidence that he had done anything wrong, but they weren't quite done with Joseph. When Joseph went to his furniture repair shop to open up for the day a few hours later, he found 5 detectives waiting for him. They immediately seized the long needles that Joseph used for working on upholstery to see if maybe they matched the wounds on Frank Burns' head. Now, Joseph complained very bitterly to police. He couldn't even do his job. Reporters who had been tailing Joseph saw him blow up at the police, and they immediately crowded around the little upholsterer. And this time, Joseph shocked them by saying really horrible things about his dead wife and daughter. He said that his daughter, Ronnie, was wild and willful and that she loved to tease men. Maybe one of them had finally killed her for it, he said. When one of the reporters suggested that the killer could be someone romantically involved with his wife, he scoffed. He said that his wife was so cold that men, aside from him, probably would not find her attractive. As Joseph was talking to these reporters, he showed no sign that he was actually grieving the loss of his family. Instead, he just seemed really, really mad. And so after a wave of newspaper stories printed Joseph's harsh comments, Lyons' investigators began focusing even harder on Joseph. He certainly seemed unfeeling enough to potentially have killed his own family. Now, the detectives were obviously very suspicious of Joseph Gideon, but that didn't mean anything he said to them they didn't take seriously. And so when Joseph suggested police should really look into all the men in his daughter's life to see if maybe they had something to do with it, the police said, yeah, we will do that. And so the police tracked down all the men who had dated Ronnie over the years, or Ronnie had been close to in some way, starting with Stephen Butter, the man that Ronnie had been with the evening right before she had died, the best friend of her boyfriend. Stephen had gone to pick up Ronnie for Easter Mass, as they had planned to, on Sunday morning. But when he got there, just before 10 a.m., no one answered the buzzer. And so Stephen went back home, perplexed, and he kept calling Ronnie periodically throughout the day until 3 p.m. when a detective answered the phone. The detective told Stephen they needed to talk to him right away, but didn't say why. By the time Stephen got to the police station an hour later, he was so nervous he was visibly shaking. But when police began speaking to him, he didn't really add much of value. Stephen didn't even know Ronnie was dead until he got to the police station. All Stephen could say was that Ronnie was a, quote, swell kid, and they had a, quote, swell time together. Lyons pretty much immediately dismissed Stephen as a suspect, but Ronnie's social life left investigators with plenty more men to talk to, and Ronnie had some seriously complicated relationships with men. When Ronnie's boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, spoke to detectives at his home, he alternated between praise for Ronnie as a sweet church-going young woman and slammed her as a party girl who often stayed out all night and loved to, quote, play the field with other men. Lincoln admitted that he worried his girlfriend would cheat on him when he was away, but he trusted his friend Stephen to keep an eye on her for him, which is why he had set them up to hang out that night. But Lincoln would say, despite the quarrels they had in their relationship, he loved Ronnie and was absolutely devastated by her death. Also, Lincoln had a solid alibi. He was 50 miles away with family when Ronnie was killed. Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby, came to the police station next for questioning, and he insisted he had no hard feelings after his marriage to Ronnie broke up. He said they were both too young to be married, and they stayed friends and even got together once in a while. He had last seen Ronnie a few weeks before her death when they went to a movie. At some point, Bobby would tell Detective Lyons that he really hoped they would find the murderer and send him to the electric chair. So far, Ronnie's love life had not produced much in the way of a suspect. Of all her partners, Bobby was probably Lyons' best bet, given the failed marriage, but both Bobby and Ronnie seemed to have genuinely moved on from each other. Then, one of Ronnie's closest friends suggested that police take a look at a sometime chauffeur named George Frenchy Guéret, who previously rented a room in Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was an eccentric man who wore his chauffeur's uniform even when he wasn't working, and he spoke in a heavy French accent. But behind his kind of goofy, harmless exterior, Frenchy had a criminal record. Most importantly, according to Ronnie's friend, he had fought with Ronnie's mother, Mary, over money. In addition, Frenchy had developed a crush on Ronnie, but she had no interest, and she told him to leave her alone. Two of Lyons' detectives visited Frenchy at his rented room a few blocks from Ronnie's apartment. There, they would find 2 bloody handkerchiefs, which Frenchy blamed on nosebleeds. Frenchy did have an alibi, saying he had spent Easter weekend at a buddy's apartment, but when the detectives visited that apartment, they found no less than 4 ice picks, including one that appeared to be blood-stained. By Monday afternoon, the late editions of the newspapers were speculating that Frenchy had committed these murders, perhaps with the help of the friend he stayed with that weekend. Police quickly arrested both men. But a police analyst determined that the stain on the ice pick seized by police was not blood, it was rust. And they had no other evidence to connect Frenchy and his friend to the murders, and so Lyons reluctantly let them go. At a crowded press conference on Tuesday, 3 days after the murders, Lyons showed serious frustration from the 3 days of nonstop investigating with little to show for it. He admitted that detectives were, quote, in the dark about who killed Mary, Ronnie, and Frank. There was one very small bit of good news, though. The coroner reported that there was no physical evidence that either woman was sexually assaulted. Maybe the killer was not a sex fiend after all. And so the detectives decided to redouble their efforts on looking into Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. Everywhere Joseph went in those first days after the murders, he was followed by reporters, giving him endless chances to say something to make his position worse. He knew that he was under police scrutiny, but he boasted to reporters that the police could not break him, and he flew into a rage when reporters questioned his whereabouts at the time of the killings. Adding to public suspicions, the walls of Joseph's shop were covered with French postcards featuring naked women, and he admitted to a fondness for erotica. One newspaper said that Joseph suffered from, quote, queer animal desires that prompted him to leave his wife. Maybe, the newspaper speculated, Joseph was driven by some perversion to kill his own family. On Thursday, April 1st, so 4 days after the murders, detectives returned to Joseph's shop to look for a long needle that they had missed on their first sweep. They had already confiscated most of Joseph's tools, but a sharp-eyed upholsterer who did not know Joseph, who just happened to see a picture in the newspaper of all of Joseph's equipment that had been confiscated, told police that it looked like one needle was missing. He said it was a foot-long, quote, regulator with a very sharp point that every good furniture restorer would have. And police knew this tool was plenty big enough to have been the weapon that killed Frank Byrne. Newspapers immediately started running with the story, referring to the missing needle as the Gideon death needle, but the detectives would never find it. However, in their search for this other needle, they would find something else very unexpected in Joseph's shop, an unlicensed, loaded .38 caliber revolver hidden in a corner. Since Joseph had previously told police that he did not have a gun, they had now caught him in a lie. When one of the detectives phoned Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons with this news, he was elated. Now, Lyons said, they had Joseph Gideon right where they wanted him. Lyons ordered his men to start trailing Joseph wherever he went, just like the reporters were doing. They were going to allow Joseph to attend the funeral for his wife and his daughter, but that didn't mean he'd be going alone. Lyons told them to give Joseph a police escort so that a law enforcement officer was never more than an arm's length away. Several thousand people were waiting outside McCabe's funeral parlor when the police car carrying Joseph Gideon pulled up on Thursday afternoon. People were out on the sidewalk, while many more were draped over fire escapes, looking out windows, and even standing on the roof. Many hoped for a glimpse of the man suspected of killing Ronnie and Mary, and when Joseph stepped out of the police car, surrounded by 4 detectives, someone in the crowd shouted, "There he is!" But before anyone could lay a hand on Joseph, the detectives hustled him through the mob and into the chapel. There, Mary and Ronnie lay side by side in open caskets, surrounded by flowers, many from Ronnie's male admirers, as well as artists that she had worked with. The chapel was absolutely full, but only a handful of people actually knew the victims personally. People such as her ex-husband Bobby Flower, her boyfriend Lincoln Hauser, and her boyfriend's best friend, Stephen Butter, the last person to see Ronnie alive, aside from her killer. And there were a few people who had known the Gideons from the past, people like Bob Irwin, the young sculptor who had once boarded with Ronnie and Mary and asked Ronnie's older sister Ethel to marry him. Bob dabbed a tear from his eye with a handkerchief as the priest stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. After the service was over, several of the men who had loved Ronnie kissed her as they passed her casket and openly wept. As for Ronnie's father, Joseph, he would keep his composure inside of the chapel, but when they all made their way out to the cemetery, he would break down in heavy sobs as he watched his daughter and ex-wife lowered into the ground. As he wept, his other daughter, Ethel, ran over and gave him a hug and cried with him. After the burial was over, police did not wait. They immediately grabbed Joseph and took him directly to the police station, where they would question him for another 6 straight hours, shaking and occasionally slapping Joseph the whole time. Despite Joseph's emotional display at the cemetery, detectives still strongly suspected he had killed his own family members, and if they pressed hard enough, he would confess. But without that missing needle that apparently Joseph could have used to kill the boarder Frank, or some other physical evidence linking Joseph to the crime in some way, prosecutors were not able to charge Joseph with murder. And when Joseph continued to deny that he was the killer, the police went to their plan B, and they charged him with illegal gun possession and put him in jail for that. By early Friday morning, April 2nd, less than a week after the murders, jail guards were taking Joseph's belt, necktie, and shoelaces to prevent him from committing suicide. Then they led him to his cell. Joseph's mind was numb as he sat on his jail cell cot, staring up at the bare light bulb that lit up the cell. The police had been questioning him relentlessly since he found the bodies of his wife and daughter 4 days earlier, and when detectives weren't grilling him, reporters followed his every move and shouted more questions. He had slept no more than maybe a few hours the whole time. For just a second, Joseph recalled last Sunday morning when he had been so excited to tell his daughters that he was getting back together with their mother. And now that was all gone. Then Joseph Gideon fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons was amazed at Joseph Gideon's stubbornness. He was the leading suspect in a triple murder, but Joseph refused to give an inch, even when police questioned him for hours and tried to scare the man with threats, shoves, or slaps across his face. Lyons was hopeful that Joseph would crack after a few days in jail, but he knew that his team could not put all their hopes in just one suspect. After all, the case they had against Joseph was far from airtight. And one of Lyons' best detectives had found what looked like a pretty good piece of evidence pointing toward a different suspect, one that made it look like Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby Flower, was not who he appeared to be. The evidence found was Ronnie's diary. The entries from 4 years earlier in 1933, when she married Bobby Flower, oozed with love for him. She would do anything for Bobby. He was her soulmate. This tracked with what Bobby had told police. But in 1934, Ronnie's diary entries took a dark turn. She started writing about how Bobby seemed to be stalking her sister Ethel. Bobby was out of his head, she wrote, and she was afraid of him. The discovery suggested that Bobby Flower lied to the police about having, quote, no hard feelings for Ronnie. Now, Bobby looked like an obsessed and potentially dangerous liar. So, Detective Lyons went straight to Ronnie's sister Ethel. He figured she would be the best person to fill him in on the details of Bobby Flower's troubling past. When the detective arrived at Ethel's home in Queens, she greeted him cordially, but as Lyons started explaining that he wanted to hear more about how Bobby Flower stalked her, he watched as Ethel's face grew more and more puzzled. Finally, Ethel interrupted Lyons and just asked him, "What are you talking about?" And now it was Lyons' turn to be confused. He pulled out Ronnie's diary and began walking Ethel through some of the entries. At first, Ethel just stared at the little book uncomprehendingly. But when Lyons started reading her the passages about how Ronnie was afraid of Bobby and how Bobby wouldn't leave the family alone, a light suddenly clicked on inside of Ethel's brain. She put her hand on Lyons' arm to silence him, and with big, serious eyes, she said she knew exactly what Ronnie was talking about. Inspector Lyons walked out of Ethel's parlor, reeling from what she had just told him, but clear about what he needed to do. He now realized that he had been completely wrong in his interpretation of the diary. Now he had to learn more about Bobby, a lot more. He immediately dispatched one detective to Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital in upstate New York to pull Bobby's medical records. And when Lyons saw what the records contained, he and his colleagues became increasingly alarmed at the kind of person they were dealing with. Bobby had a history of mental breakdowns and sudden explosions of violence dating back to when he was just 14 years old. Once he tried to amputate his own penis and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a year and a half. In fact, he had just been released when he had met Ronnie. There was no time to lose. They needed to talk to Bobby right away. So they went straight to the boarding house where he was staying. Bobby wasn't there, but his journal was. In it, he ranted and raved about Mary and Ronnie and how they were the reason his relationship with Ethel had broken up. Meanwhile, other detectives have been going from store to store in the New York City area, trying to find who sold the killer the gray suede glove that was left behind at the crime scene. Eventually, they found a young clerk in a J.J. Newberry's department store who remembered selling the gloves to a man just a few short weeks before. And when this young clerk described the man, it matched the description of Bobby perfectly. Inspector Lyons now realized he had a new primary suspect, someone with a clear motive to harm the Gideons and who had been physically linked to the crime scene. Lyons had Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, released on bail from his firearms charges. He knew Joseph was not the killer, and early on Monday morning, April 5th, Lyons called a press conference to say that police now knew who committed the Easter Sunday massacre. And he passed out pictures of this new person to the gathered reporters. Soon, Bobby's face would be on the front page of newspapers all across America. Over the next 3 months, police heard dozens of rumors about where to find Bobby, but none of them panned out until late June, when a hotel employee in Cleveland reported that one of her coworkers looked exactly like Bobby. The man called himself Bob Murray, but she offered that it could be a fake name. Unfortunately, the woman decided to speak to this so-called Bob Murray person about his resemblance to the Bobby police were looking for, and it turned out it was Bobby. This startled him and gave him a warning that his cover was blown, and so Bob Murray jumped on the first Greyhound bus headed for Chicago, leaving the police empty-handed again. The media began to poke fun at the police's inability to catch their murderer, portraying him as this crafty fugitive who was capable of eluding a nationwide manhunt. But it was at this time, totally out of the blue, Bobby decided to just turn himself in. He figured that eventually he was going to get caught, so why not make some money first? He decided to call one of Chicago's big city newspapers, the Chicago Herald-Examiner, and sell his whole sordid story. On the evening of Saturday, June 26th, Bobby sat down with reporters to describe in detail his role in the triple murder 3 months earlier. But it would turn out this Bobby was not Bobby Flower, Ronnie's ex-husband. This was a very different Bobby. When Inspector Lyons had gone to Ethel's house with Ronnie's diary and started asking her about why Bobby Flower had begun stalking her, Ethel had been totally lost. Bobby Flower had been the love of Ethel's sister's life and had remained her friend until her death. But when Inspector Lyons started showing Ethel the actual passages of Ronnie's writing, it clicked for her and she realized Ronnie was talking about a different Bobby in her diary. Not Bobby Flower, but Bobby Irwin, the young sculptor who had once rented a room with the family and subsequently become infatuated with Ethel. And so the police had just confused the two Bobbies. Here's the real story of what happened to Ronnie and Mary Gideon and the boarder that was living with them, Frank Burns. Bobby Irwin was a down-on-his-luck 26-year-old sculptor who the Gideon family had taken on as a boarder in 1934, 3 years before the murders. Ronnie had been 17 at the time and was still recovering from her failed marriage to the other Bobby. Ethel had been 21 years old and was building a career as a secretary after her own marriage had just fizzled out. Both sisters at the time were avoiding romantic entanglements. But Bobby Irwin, who called himself Bob, even though Ronnie referred to him exclusively as Bobby in her diary, was a confident guy. He was sure that one day he would be recognized as one of the world's greatest sculptors, and he thought Ethel was totally beautiful. He had even convinced Ethel to sit for him so that he could create a sculpture of her head out of marble. And the end product, Ethel's whole family agreed, was totally striking. The sculpture version of Ethel was both beautiful and peaceful. Her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. While Ronnie had always thought Bob Irwin was very creepy, Ethel had actually found him very talented and charismatic at first. He would take her to art museums where he would tell her all about the great masters and how his own artistic technique, something he called visualization, would lead him to the top as well. Ethel enjoyed the outings, but when Irwin asked her to marry him one summer night as they walked on the East River waterfront down by the piers, she was floored. Ethel told Irwin no and said that she was already engaged to an aspiring lawyer. This would be the man that Ethel would later marry. She said she still wanted to be friends with Irwin, but Irwin was totally heartbroken. After that, living in the same house was very uncomfortable, and so Irwin moved out later in 1934. That had been the end of the story as far as Ethel was concerned, but the story was not over for Bobby Irwin. By March 27, 1937, the day of the murders, Bobby Irwin lived at a boarding house a short walk from Ronnie and Mary's place. He still hadn't made it big as an artist. That very day, in fact, he had interviewed for another job that did not pan out. And he blamed the failures of his life on Ethel. He decided he couldn't live with her being married to someone else, so he sharpened his ice pick and set out for the Gideon home. His plan was actually just to kill Ethel, but his plan was flawed. He didn't realize that Ethel did not live there anymore. She had her own place with her husband in Queens. No one was home in the apartment when Irwin arrived, so he waited on the sidewalk until Mary Gideon arrived. Mary was not scared of Bob Irwin at all. Despite his obvious pining for her older daughter, he seemed like a nice guy. So she let him follow her up to the apartment. Mary was tired and not eager to visit, but she was polite as Erwin pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw her. In reality, he was stalling for time in hopes that Ethel would arrive. Then Mary's boarder, Frank Burns, came home and said hello before quickly retiring to his own bedroom. Eventually, Mary got tired of this long visit and just told Erwin that he had to leave. But Erwin said he was not going to leave until he saw Ethel. And so Mary said, okay, well, I'm going to get my boarder to throw you out. And that's when Erwin lunged for Mary's throat, squeezing as tight as he could and holding on even as she scratched his face repeatedly with her fingernails. And he kept choking Mary for 20 minutes until she was completely still. Then he stuffed her body under the bed in one of the smaller bedrooms. Erwin was astonished that Frank did not come out of his room during all the commotion, but he didn't have time to think about the boarder. He was there to kill Ethel. It occurred to Erwin that Ronnie might be the next person to come home, not Ethel, and he didn't want to kill Ronnie. It's true that she had disapproved of his relationship with Ethel, but he didn't hold a grudge about that. So he walked into the bathroom and grabbed a bar of soap and put it inside of a sock. If Ronnie came home first, he decided, he would just smack her in the face with the soap and hopefully knock her out. Erwin waited for nearly 2 hours in the dark of the Gideons' apartment until finally he heard Ronnie's voice after 3 a.m. speaking to her little dog. And when Ronnie finally came into the bedroom where Erwin was waiting, he wound up and smashed her on the left cheek with the bar of soap inside of the sock, shattering the soap into pieces. But to Erwin's surprise, this vicious blow seemed to have no effect on Ronnie. She just stood there. So Erwin grabbed her by the throat and pushed her onto the bed. He would say that he did not want to kill her at this point, but she was just making it so hard. He tried to disguise his voice, hoping she wouldn't recognize him, but she spoke to him by name as he was grappling with her, and she told him he was going to get in trouble if he didn't stop. And this was just too much for Erwin, and so he would furiously choke the life out of Ronnie and then rip off her clothes just to make the attack look as degrading as possible. By then, it was after 5 a.m., Ethel had not come back yet, and so Erwin knew he just needed to leave. But first, he knew he had to get rid of Frank, the boarder. Now, Frank never came out during the 2 attacks on the women, likely because he was almost deaf and didn't hear them. But Erwin thought he just could not take any chances, so he crept into Frank's room and began stabbing Frank in the face with his ice pick again and again and again. Finally, after Frank was dead, Erwin headed for the door, his only regret being that he did not get to kill Ethel. The Chicago Herald and Examiner paid Erwin $5,000 for his confession. It was the most money Erwin had ever made in his life, but the cops arrested him before he could spend it. New York prosecutors said they would be seeking the death penalty, but Erwin would plead guilty on the eve of his trial and would be sentenced to 139 years in prison instead.